Alrighty, so yesterday I did the Seattle Sounders in terms of their road to MLS Cup and looking at their entire season and how they've got to the ultimate game of MLS, which is MLS Cup. Today I am going to be doing the other finalist, Toronto FC. And if you thought Seattle's journey to MLS Cup this season was crazy and it was kind of a wild ride, you have not seen Toronto FC journey to MLS Cup because TFC season has just their road to MLS Cup this season has just been insane. And there's a couple of point of the season you wonder, are they even actually going to make the playoffs to let alone actually competing for MLS Cup? And that I kind of look at TFC season and that it does kind of provide a little bit of an aspect to what the Seattle Sounders has been doing for the past couple of seasons, which is have a bad first half of the season and then go on a crazy resurgence in the second half of the season to basically make the playoffs and get on a hot streak, which TFC kind of did that, although unlike Seattle, where when they do go on that crazy resurgence and get themselves all the way to the top part of the Western Conference table, TFC did try to do that, but they kind of didn't do it as effective as Seattle, and they actually kind of got a little bit lucky. The fact that they were able to host a game at BMO Field, and that, it was all down to on decision day where a couple of the teams that, all they need to do is win their game so that they can host at least a MLS playoff home game once in the playoffs. Yeah, they did not quite do that, and that things kind of pan out for TFC in terms of hosting an MLS playoff game this season. But let's go all the way back to March, where early part of the TFC season, like Seattle, they actually did very well, and that they got off to a great start by beating Philly 3-1, and this was back when nobody know exactly how good Philly was, and that this was a game between two very unproven teams, and that certainly in the first game TFC kind of proved themselves that they could be a team that maybe get themselves back into the playoffs, because keep in mind this is a team that is coming off of a very disappointing season where they went deep into CCL, were just on the verge of actually becoming the first MLS team to win CCL, only to just basically collapse in that season and don't make the playoffs. So there was definitely a lot of expectation of what's going to happen this season, but there was also some people like me thinking that this was just going to be a rebuilding year and that they are building something for the future. And also keep in mind, this is the first season when they do not have Sebastian Giovinco with this team, as it has been for the past couple of seasons, and really is why TFC for the past couple of years has been one of the most dominant team in MLS. But going back to the early part of the season, like I said, they beat Philly 3-1 in that game. Then they of course won 3-2 against New England to improve their record to 2-0, and they won 4-0 against NYCFC to improve their record to 3-0. And keep in mind, this was also when NYCFC was one of those teams that was kind of a little bit unproven and kind of in the same shoe as TFC is, where one of their legend player unfortunately got traded or depart from their clubs in the off season, and that TFC of course was able to pass that test, and they not only passed that test but put on a statement win against what we would later thought to be the best team in the Eastern Conference. So they improved their record to 3-0. Then they of course drew 2-2 against Chicago, which was definitely not a good result consider Chicago wasn't doing well even in the early part of the season. Then they lost 3-2 to Seattle, as I mentioned yesterday. That was the only other meeting between the two finalists of this season, and their record is now at 3-1. Then they had that crazy game against Minnesota where it was a very back and forth game, and that they end up winning 4-3 in that game, and that was also the game when I think, if I remember, the Loons actually got 2 men sent off late in the game, and they improved their record to 4-1. However, things kind of went went bad for TFC in the next game as they lost 2-1 against Portland and they dropped their records to 4-1-2. So you can definitely see there are some inconsistent with TFC after they got off to a very hot start, and that inconsistency continued when they were able to bounce back with a win against Orlando City to improve their record to 5-1-2. Now, the very next game, they lost to Atlanta 2-0 to drop their record to 5-1-3. And while some people will think, well, it's no big deal of them losing to Atlanta because Atlanta was started to picking up again, this is when I really want to highlight this game as the game where things just completely went south for TFC, and that this was also when they look like a team that you even question whether or not if they are actually going to make the playoffs. I mean, early on, I feel like people think that they are going to get back into the playoffs and maybe they're going to get back to MLS Cup, but since that April run where it was a little bit inconsistent, and then, by the way, I forgot to mention, in this game between TFC and Minnesota, this was also the game when Pozuelo, of course, came in, and it was his first game where he scored 2 goals in his dream debut. But even with Pozuelo and the $10 million signings that they did, things kind of started to fall apart for this team because of injuries and just, it looked like something very similar to the TFC team last season. Because after that loss to Atlanta, they of course lose 2-1 to Philly at home to drop their record to 5-1-4. They did drew 0-0 to DC to put their record at 5-2-4. Then they lost 3-0 to RSL on the road to drop their record back to 500. Then they go below 500 for the first time in the season by losing 2-1 to the Quakes to drop their record to 5-2-6. And in the very next game, they drew 1-1 against Vancouver to basically put their record at 5-3-6. And these resort definitely was not good resort. I mean, consider losing to a Quakes team that rarely wins on the road, and then drawing to a Vancouver team that at that point, that's when the Whitecaps started to also collapse and started to drop down the table. It was a very dark time for TFC, but that was not the end of the dark time, because it would continue in the very next game where they drew 2-2 to SKC to put their record at 5-4-6, but in many ways this could have been easily 5-3-7 for TFC, because if it wasn't for a last second goal that they scored in this game against SKC, they would have lost 3 in a row, or actually not 3 in a row, but they would have dropped their record to 5-3-7, and things would just get really, really bad. But things eventually did continue to go bad because despite the fact that they were heading into the Gold Cup break and thinking that, things might work out once we come back from the Gold Cup break, no, it did not work out. Instead, they lose 3-0 to Dallas to drop their record to 5-4-7. They did win against Atlanta 6-4-7, and at that time was one of the most surprising result of the year. And this was also another crazy game between for TFC, who, Atlanta, they probably should have won that one if Pity Martinez would have put away that penalty in stoppage time. And instead, on the other end, TFC won a penalty of their own, which Pozuelo, of course, puts it away. And that, in many ways, this was a classic example of a smash and grab win. Like, I don't think I've ever seen a game where one team could be just on the verge of actually losing when they gave up a penalty late, and then literally 2 minutes later, they of course won a penalty and end up winning the game. Like, that was one of the most bizarre games I've ever seen before, and that in many ways they were very lucky to walk away with a victory. Now, in the next game, they drew 1-1 against DC to drop their records to 6-5-7. Then they lose 2-0 to the Galaxy to drop their record to 6-5-8. And I think at this point they were also below the red line, and that they really spent most of their time below the red line during the middle part of the season and didn't really start to get above the red line when they had that crazy unbeaten run heading into the end of the season. Now, in the very next game, they did finally snap that 8-game winless run. Yes, they actually went 8 games without a win. I mean, there's not many teams that actually make MLS Cup that have a season where they could be winless in 8 games. That is how crazy that TFC is, and that's how incredible how we definitely did not expect Toronto to actually get into MLS Cup this year when you look at how bleak and how bad the situation is in the middle of the season. Now, July did get a little bit better, and as I mentioned, they of course finally snapped that 8-game winless run by winning 2-0 against their hated rival, the Impact, to improve their record to 7-5-8. But they kind of started to be a little bit inconsistent again, just like they were in April, where they did win 3-1 against the Red Bulls to get back to 500, and many people thought that maybe this is the turning point for TFC, and then the very next game, they lose 3-1 to Houston. I mean, as if I thought this loss to the Quakes was probably one of the worst losses that TFC have suffered at home. This was the worst loss that they have suffered at home. Like, how do you lose to a team that never usually win on the road, and a team that was also kind of dealing with crisis, and yet somehow they lost 3-1 to them, and they find themselves back below 500 with that loss, and their record now drops to 8-5-9. Now, they did bounce back the very next week when they faced another bad team, and this time they did win against that bad team known as FC Cincinnati, as they win 2-1 against them to improve their record to 9-5-9. Then they did lose 2-0 to the Red Bulls to once again drop their records below 500. Again, they were very inconsistent in July and didn't really kind of find that consistency until after this game, because little did we know that this 2-0 loss to the Red Bulls was actually the last time that TFC would lose, and that they would actually go the entire rest of the season and up until this point have not lost a single game. But even though as spectacular as it is, the fact that they went pretty much the entire season without losing a game, when you look at some of these results, you kind of think it's not really that impressive, and that in some way, I think some people will say that it's not that impressive, mainly because they draw a lot of games during the stretch. And they start that on the very next game when they drew 1-1 to Orlando City to put their record at 9-6-10, followed by another draw against Columbus 2-2 to drop their record to 9-7-10. And this was also another game where I thought they could have easily lost if it wasn't for a late Josie Altidore stoppage time winner. And that you've seen so far this season, there's been a couple of times that TFC had games where things were kind of hanging the balance, and that they were able to get a late goal to be able to, of course, at least get something out of those games. Then the very next game, they once again beat their hated rival Montreal with a 2-1 win to get themselves back to 500. Then they drew 1-1 to New England to put their record at 10-8-10, and then they finally got back above 500 for the first time since May, when they won 5-1 against FC Cincinnati to make their record to 11-8-10. Now, the following game, they had a somewhat impressive draw against NYCFC by drawing 1-1 against them to improve their record to 11-9-10. But when you look at that game, and from what I remember in that game, I remember TFC had a penalty late in the game where if they would have put that penalty away, they would have got a massive win against NYCFC. And keep in mind, this was also during the time when NYCFC was just absolute unstoppable and charging up the Eastern Conference, and that this was an NYCFC team that have only lost once this season, and they would have easily be the second team to come to Yankee Stadium and knock them down this season, but they weren't able to do it at this point. But as a little spoiler alert in terms of, well, I don't think it's really a spoiler alert because you will know what happened in the playoffs, that they actually would become the second team to knock NYCFC out in the at home, or win against NYCFC at home, and later, of course, knock them out of the playoffs. Then they, of course, won 3-2 against Colorado to improve their record to 12, 9, and 10. Then they go to LAFC and drew 1-1 against them to improve their record to 12, 10, and 10. And this was also another impressive draw for them because not many teams can go to Bank of California Stadium and somehow were able to salvage something out of that game. But I also think, I'm not sure if this is correct, but I think this was also a game where LAFC scored a late winner to salvage themselves a draw in that game. So in some sense, I would kind of say something similar to the NYCFC versus TFC game, where when you look on paper, it looks like an impressive draw, but when you actually watch the game, maybe not so. When you look at the missed opportunity that TFC had in that game, where they could have won that game if they would have either put away the penalty to take the lead or not give up a late goal to, of course, draw in that game. Then in the very next game, they drew 2-2 against Chicago to put their record at 12, 11, 10, and they finished the season with a 1-0 win against the Columbus Crew to finish their season at 13, 11, and 10. And coming into decision day, I think TFC was in the 6th spot, and that they really need a lot to kind of go into their favor in terms of actually getting the 4th seed. And guess what happened? A lot of those things that went in their favor actually happened, and that is exactly why they actually got into the 4th seed and able to host a playoff game. And that I'm also kind of interested to see, as much as I know what TFC have done in the playoffs and how they have been it's been incredible what they have done in terms of beating these tough teams on the road and beating these teams that don't usually lose at home, but they were able to beat them when they're on the road. But I'm kind of interested to see if TFC actually go the entire playoffs playing on the road, would they actually get to this point where they get to MLS Cup? Now, in the playoffs, they, of course, play against DC, and they, of course, won 5-1 against DC United after extra time. And as I mentioned during the review of that video, you might think it's a mistake that I put after extra time after that result, considering the fact how in the world would a 5-1 result can happen after extra time. Well, this was a game when TFC had the lead for most of the time, and that they were literally seconds away from winning and moving on to the next round, only to, of course, give up a late goal to DC, and then in extra time they dropped 4 goals against DC United, and that all happened in the first half of extra time. I mean, as I mentioned, there's been some very bizarre resort and some crazy kind of game that TFC involved this season. This was a classic example of it. And this, I think, might be the craziest out of them all, and that it's maybe even more crazy when they face against TFC versus Atlanta, because you just don't see extra time very often, and you definitely don't see teams drop 4 goals in extra time, especially when you just conceded a late goal. Like, usually when a team that is so close to winning and that they, of course, concede a late goal, it is a very agonizing thing, and that the momentum really shift to the team that scored the late goals, and that they looked like they were the favorites of potentially winning the game. Not in this instant. In fact, the team that scored the late goal, they were probably should have maybe think about not scoring that late goal to save themselves from what would be just an embarrassment, what we saw in the first half of extra time in this game. Now, the following game, they, of course, won 2-1 against NYCFC, and this is where I also mentioned the fact that they also become the second team to go to Yankee Stadium and beat NYCFC, and that this was a game where, I wouldn't say they play pretty in this game, but they took advantage of the mistake that NYCFC made in this game. And I know some people will say, well, they kind of got lucky because NYCFC kind of gifted the game. Well, yes, NYCFC did make those mistakes and did give them those gifted goals. But here's the thing. At the end of the day, TFC can't control those kind of mistakes that NYCFC made. And that if you're a team that's able to capitalize on your opponent's mistake, sometimes that could be the most dangerous thing to do, and that is something that it could be a recipe of moving on into the next round, and that is exactly what happened. Before in the conference final, they once again pull off another shock by winning 2-1 against Atlanta, and that was a game where, in the early moments we thought TFC was going to be done and that Atlanta was going to be go up 2-0, but Atlanta missed a penalty. They of course able to get a goal after Atlanta missed a penalty, and everything changed after that. And that they of course also score a screamer from Nick DeLeon to of course get themselves into MLS Cup. So that basically brings us to where they are right now, which is MLS Cup, and that I'm gonna talk a little bit more about MLS Cup and what I expect to happen in this game on Friday when I do the preview. But I know a lot of people are saying TFC kind of got lucky into this game and got lucky the fact that they reached to this point. I don't think so. I think in many ways this team have shown so much courage and show so much tenacity where there's just kind of like a never say die kind of aspect to this team, and that we have seen so far in not just in MLS but in sports for the past couple of years that sometimes the underdogs are some of the most dangerous team that is out there when they get into playoffs, and that we have seen some stunning kind of resort and some resort that you definitely did not expect them to be there, and yet they are of course be there, which is why I said yesterday, as much as I know Seattle is going to be heavy favorites coming into that game against Toronto FC, don't be surprised if just because people say that they're heavy favorites before the game started, that it actually means that Seattle is going to get a win, and that TFC might use that as a way to feel their kind of role of being the underdog and maybe pull off another big upset. And we said, talking about how people say that Seattle is favorites, didn't people say that Atlanta was heavy favorite against TFC, and look what happened? And didn't people say NYCFC was heavy favorite against TFC, and look what happened? So the bottom line is this fixtures could be a little bit tighter than what many people would think, but I will break it down in terms of what I expect is going to be happening and why it's going to be a little bit of a game where it's not just going to be so one-sided, and that Seattle is going to easily win this MLS Cup when I do the preview on Friday. But either way, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure you guys leave a like, smash that subscribe button, and yeah, I of course will see you guys next time.